Vivian Cole lifted her wine glass slowly, her diamonds flashing beneath the chandelier. Then she smiled at Ina Barry and said the words she had been poisoning the children with for years. "A good mother doesn't make her husband miserable." The entire dining room went silent. Ina felt the humiliation burn through her chest while Easton stared down at his plate like a coward. But before she could force another fake smile, 12-year-old Sophie pushed her chair back so hard it scraped across the marble floor. "No," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "You're the one who keeps hurting Mom." Then little Eli stood beside his sister, and for the first time in years, Ina realized her children had finally seen everything. If you've ever stayed silent just to keep a family together, this story will break your heart before it heals it. And by the end, you may ask yourself one question: how much of yourself should you sacrifice for people who never deserved your love? The Barry house looked perfect from the outside. That was the problem. The white colonial mansion sat at the end of a quiet street in Westport, Connecticut, surrounded by trimmed hedges, imported roses, and luxury SUVs that gleamed beneath soft autumn sunlight. The kind of neighborhood where women smiled politely during charity brunches while quietly competing over handbags, schools, and husbands. Ina Barry used to love this house. Now it felt like a museum built around her loneliness. Every morning began the same way. She woke before everyone else, packed Sophie's lunch exactly the way she liked it, cut Eli's pancakes into little squares because he hated syrup touching the eggs, checked Easton's dry cleaning, answered school emails, scheduled dentist appointments, smiled at neighbors, smoothed over tension. Invisible work, endless work. The kind nobody noticed until it stopped being done. By 7:30, Easton walked into the kitchen wearing a navy Tom Ford suit and the cold expression that had become more familiar than affection. "Coffee?" Ina asked softly. "Black." "No, thank you." No eye contact, no kiss, just another command tossed casually toward the woman who had once been the center of his universe. Ina slid the mug across the marble island while studying him carefully. Lately she had started measuring his moods the way people monitored storms. His jaw was tighter than usual. His phone sat face down beside him. Another late night. Another unexplained meeting. Easton scrolled through emails while Sophie wandered into the kitchen half awake. "Morning, Dad." "Hey, sweetheart." His entire face softened instantly. Ina noticed it because she noticed everything. The warmth in his voice, the gentleness, the smile he no longer gave her. Eli ran in moments later wearing superhero pajamas. "Mom, can you help me find my science folder already in your backpack?" Ina said. Eli grinned. "You always save me." Something painful twisted inside her chest. Because once upon a time, Easton used to say that too. Vivian Cole arrived exactly 20 minutes later without warning, just like always. The front door opened before Ina could even reach it. "I made copies of the country club guest list," Vivian announced, while stepping inside, dressed in beige cashmere and diamonds before 10 in the morning. Some people simply cannot be invited. Her sharp eyes landed on Ina's leggings and loose sweater, and apparently some people no longer dress like married women. Ina inhaled quietly. "Good morning to you too, Vivian." Vivian ignored her entirely and kissed Sophie's cheek. "There's my beautiful girl." Then Eli, "My handsome grandson," never once acknowledging Ina as part of the family she had built. Easton barely looked up from his phone. That hurt more than Vivian's insults ever could. At first, years ago, Easton used to defend her. "Mom, stop. Mom, that's enough. Mom, don't speak to Ina like that." But over time, those moments disappeared, and silence replaced love. Vivian walked around the kitchen inspecting everything. "You know," she said casually, "I saw Rebecca Calloway yesterday. 3 children, and she still manages to look elegant." Ina kept wiping the counter. Vivian smiled faintly. Some women simply understand that motherhood isn't an excuse to let themselves go. There it was, another tiny cut disguised as conversation. Easton sipped his coffee, silent, always silent. Sophie looked uncomfortable. Eli stared down at his cereal. Ina forced a smile she no longer felt. "I'll keep that in mind." But inside, exhaustion was beginning to rot into resentment. Because Vivian didn't just insult her appearance. She questioned her worth. Constantly. In front of the children, in front of Easton, in front of strangers. And every time Ina swallowed the humiliation to keep the peace. That afternoon after school pickup, Ina sat in the car outside Sophie's dance studio while rain tapped softly against the windshield. She checked her reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, hair thrown into a careless bun, a woman disappearing slowly. It hadn't always been like this. Before Sophie, before Eli, before sacrificing herself piece by piece for a marriage that now felt emotionally one-sided. Ina had been brilliant, sharp, confident. At 28, she was one of the youngest corporate strategy consultants at Monroe & Pierce Consulting in Manhattan. She traveled constantly closed impossible deals and intimidated boardrooms full of men twice her age. That was where she met Easton. Back then, he looked at her like she was extraordinary. Not convenient, not replaceable. Extraordinary. "You're the smartest woman I've ever met," he used to tell her. Now he barely looked at her at all. Her phone buzzed suddenly. "A message from Easton. Running late. Don't wait up. No heart. No explanation." Ina stared at the text longer than she should have. Then another message appeared. From Vivian. "Make sure Sophie wears the blue dress Friday. Easton says it's the only color that flatters her." Ina froze. Easton says. Not Ina says. Not Sophie likes. Easton says. Every decision in this family somehow circled back to Easton and Vivian, as if Ina existed only to execute instructions. That night, Sophie barely touched dinner. "You okay, baby?" Ina asked gently. Sophie shrugged. Vivian, who had invited herself over again, answered instead. "She's probably stressed." Easton loosened his tie while scrolling through his phone. About what Vivian gave Ina a pointed look. Children absorb tension in a household. Ina felt heat crawl up her neck. "What's that supposed to mean?" Vivian sighed dramatically. "Oh, Ina, not everything is an attack." But it always was. Every word, every smile, every subtle humiliation. Eli suddenly spoke quietly. "Mom makes us feel better when we're sad." The table fell silent. Vivian gave a thin smile. "Of course she does, sweetheart. But mothers are supposed to do more than comfort. They're supposed to create stability, too." Ina looked at Easton, waiting, begging silently for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he cut into his steak. "Can we not do this tonight? Not defend Ina, not stop Vivian, just avoid discomfort." Because avoiding conflict had become more important to him than protecting his wife. Later that night, Ina tucked Sophie into bed. "Mom." "Yeah." Sophie hesitated. Children always hesitated before repeating something an adult told them. Ina had started noticing that too. "Did you make Dad unhappy?" The world stopped. Ina felt something crack silently inside her chest. What Sophie looked nervous immediately. "I'm sorry. Grandma just said." "What did Grandma say?" Sophie stared down at her blanket. "She said Dad used to laugh more before you stopped caring about yourself." Ina physically stopped breathing for a second. Not because the insult hurt, but because it had reached her children. Poison always spreads eventually. Ina sat beside her daughter carefully. "Sophie, adults say cruel things sometimes when they're unhappy themselves. But is it true? Ina looked at her daughter's frightened little face and realized something horrifying. Vivian hadn't just been humiliating her. She had been rewriting her children's image of her. Slowly, strategically, like erosion. And suddenly, Ina understood why Sophie had become distant lately, why Eli went quiet whenever Vivian visited, why both children watched her so carefully now. Someone had been teaching them that their mother was the problem. Ina kissed Sophie's forehead gently, despite the tears burning behind her eyes. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "None of this is your fault." But long after the lights went out, Ina sat alone in the dark hallway outside her children's bedrooms with one terrifying realization repeating endlessly inside her mind. If she stayed silent much longer, she might lose her children emotionally before she ever lost them legally. Ina stopped sleeping deeply after that night. Every sound inside the house pulled her awake now. The vibration of Easton's phone, the garage door opening after midnight, whispers downstairs, the cold side of the bed beside her. Her body had learned what her heart still refused to fully admit. Something was terribly wrong. 3 days after Sophie's question, Ina stood alone in the laundry room folding Easton's dress shirts when his phone lit up on the counter nearby. He had left it there accidentally. That almost never happened. Ina froze. A message preview appeared across the screen. "Celeste last night was dangerous, but worth it." Ina's stomach dropped so violently she had to grip the counter. For a second, her brain tried to protect her. Maybe it's business. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe... Then another message appeared. "Celeste. She suspects something. You need to handle it." Ina stopped breathing. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too quiet. She stared at the phone while her pulse hammered inside her ears. She could open it. She knew the passcode, Sophie's birthday. But before she could touch it, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Easton entered the laundry room, loosened tie hanging around his neck. The second he saw the phone in her hand, his expression changed. Sharp, alert. "What are you doing?" Ina slowly looked up. "Who's Celeste?" The silence between them stretched painfully. Then Easton walked over calmly and picked up the phone. "A colleague." Ina laughed once, a tiny broken sound. "She says last night was dangerous." Easton's jaw tightened. "You went through my messages. You're cheating on me instead of guilt." Guilt irritation flashed across his face. "That's your concern right now." Ina stared at him in disbelief. "My concern. You've become paranoid lately, Ina." There it was again. The manipulation. The way he twisted reality until she questioned her own instincts. "You're lying to me." Easton sighed dramatically like she was exhausting him. "You know what? I don't have the energy for this tonight." Then he walked away. Just like that. Leaving her standing there with humiliation crawling beneath her skin. No reassurance, no comfort, no denial strong enough to sound convincing, because deep down they both knew the truth. That night, Ina lay awake beside him while Easton slept peacefully. Or pretended to. She stared at the ceiling and replayed every moment from the last year, the late meetings, the sudden gym obsession, the expensive cologne, the emotional distance, the way he flinched when she touched him now, and worst of all, the indifference. Cheating hurt, but indifference destroyed people slowly. The next morning, Vivian appeared again. Uninvited. Of course. Ina was making coffee when Vivian stepped into the kitchen carrying shopping bags from Saks Fifth Avenue. "Sophie needs better winter coats," Vivian announced. Ina kept her voice calm. "She already has 3. "Yes, but not tasteful ones." Vivian removed her gloves carefully before glancing at Ina. "You look tired." Ina said nothing. Vivian smirked faintly. You know men become restless when a home feels emotionally heavy. There was a deliberate cruelty in the way she said things, never direct enough to confront. Always enough to wound. Ina finally turned toward her. Do you enjoy hurting me? Vivian blinked innocently. What a dramatic question. I'm serious. Vivian stepped closer. No, Ina. I enjoy honesty. There's a difference. Then she lowered her voice. Easton had ambition before he married you. Ina felt anger flicker beneath her exhaustion. He still has ambition. Yes, Vivian replied smoothly, but now he also has obligations. Obligations. Not family, not love. Obligations. Ina suddenly understood something important. Vivian never saw her as Easton's partner, only as the woman who trapped him into domesticity, the woman who distracted him from greatness. And maybe Easton had started believing that too. Later that afternoon, Ina attended Sophie's school fundraiser alone because Easton claimed he had another client dinner. The ballroom buzzed with wealthy parents' polished smiles, champagne glasses, and fake warmth. Ina wore a black silk dress she hadn't touched in years. She almost didn't recognize herself in the mirror before leaving. For the first time in months, strangers looked at her when she entered a room. Not through her. At her. You're Sophie's mom, right? Ina turned politely and saw her. Celeste Whitmore. Beautiful. Effortlessly polished. Tall blonde hair swept over one shoulder. Sharp white pantsuit. Diamond earrings that whispered old money instead of screaming for attention. The kind of woman who knew exactly how attractive she was and weaponized it carefully. Ina forced a smile. Yes. And you are Celeste. The pause afterward felt intentional, like she expected the name to mean something. Maybe it already did. I work with Easton. Of course you do. Ina swallowed carefully. That's nice. Celeste smiled warmly enough to fool everyone else in the room, but Ina noticed the subtle arrogance underneath it. The confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. I've heard so much about you. Something about the sentence felt cruel. Because Easton barely spoke to Ina lately, yet apparently he spoke about her to Celeste. Ina maintained composure. Hopefully good things. Celeste tilted her head. Easton says you're very devoted to your children. Not intelligent, not accomplished, not beautiful, devoted, domestic, safe. Ina smiled tightly. He used to admire more than that. For the first time, Celeste looked slightly uncomfortable. Good. Before either woman could continue, Easton suddenly appeared behind them, and his entire body language changed when he saw Celeste. Alive, animated, warm. Ina noticed immediately the smile, the eye contact, the energy he no longer brought home. Hey, Easton said softly to Celeste. Softly, Ina almost forgot he could sound gentle. Celeste touched his arm casually. We were just talking. Easton glanced at Ina briefly, too briefly, then back to Celeste. Vivian suddenly approached from across the ballroom carrying champagne, and the moment she saw Celeste, her face lit up. There she is! Vivian kissed Celeste's cheek affectionately. Ina stood frozen. Because Vivian never touched her like that, not once in 10 years. Celeste, darling, you look stunning. Thank you, Vivian. Darling. Ina felt like she was watching another woman slide effortlessly into her life, into her family, into her marriage. Vivian turned toward a nearby group of women. This is Celeste Whitmore, brilliant attorney, Stanford educated, absolutely exceptional. Then her eyes flicked toward Ina for half a second. The comparison was deliberate, public, cruel. One of the women smiled politely at Ina. Oh yes, you're Easton's wife. Wife, not Ina. Not a person. just a title attached to a man. Then it happened, small enough that nobody else would notice, big enough to destroy her. Easton placed his hand against Celeste's lower back as they laughed about something together. Comfortable, instinctive, intimate. Ina felt physically sick, because people didn't touch each other like that accidentally. And worse, Celeste leaned into it naturally, like it had happened many times before. Vivian noticed Ina watching, and smiled. Actually smiled, as if Ina's pain pleased her. Then Vivian said the sentence that would replay inside Ina's head for weeks afterward. Celeste has always belonged in our world. Our world, meaning not yours. Ina stood there surrounded by luxury and laughter while humiliation burned through her body so violently she could barely breathe. And for the first time in her marriage, she stopped wondering whether she was imagining things, because deep down she finally knew. They weren't hiding the affair anymore. They were slowly preparing her replacement. After the fundraiser, something inside Ina changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was quieter than that, like the final thread snapping inside a rope that had already been fraying for years. She stopped asking Easton where he was going, stopped waiting up for him at night, stopped pretending she believed his excuses. But the worst part wasn't the affair anymore. It was how comfortable everyone had become with humiliating her, especially Vivian. 3 days after the fundraiser, Ina walked downstairs wearing jeans and a cream sweater when she heard laughter coming from the living room. Sophie was giggling. Eli sounded excited, and another woman's voice floated through the house. Ina froze halfway down the staircase. Celeste. Vivian sat on the couch sipping tea while Celeste helped Eli build a miniature Lego bridge on the coffee table. Easton stood nearby smiling, in Ina's house, at another woman playing with their children. Nobody had warned her Celeste was coming over. Nobody thought they needed to. "Oh," Vivian said casually when she noticed Ina. There you are. Like she was late to her own life. Celeste stood smoothly. "Ina, I hope this isn't awkward." The audacity nearly took Ina's breath away. Easton walked toward her. Mom invited her for lunch. Ina stared at him. "And you thought that was appropriate?" Easton lowered his voice immediately. "Can you not make this into something? As if another woman sitting comfortably inside their home with their children was a minor misunderstanding. Ina looked toward Sophie. Her daughter seemed happy, relaxed, comfortable around Celeste. That hurt more than anything. Vivian smiled into her teacup. Celeste was just helping Eli with his engineering project. She's wonderful with children. Ina's chest tightened. Because the statement wasn't accidental. Nothing Vivian said ever was. Celeste stepped back politely. "I should probably go." "No," Vivian said quickly. "Stay." Then she looked directly at Ina. "Unless this is going to become another emotional scene." Easton exhaled impatiently. "There are kids here. Meaning behave. Swallow it. Stay quiet. Like always." Ina looked around the room slowly. At the woman replacing her. At the husband allowing it. At the mother-in-law orchestrating all of it openly now. And suddenly, she felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. "I'm taking a walk," she said quietly. Vivian gave a soft, dramatic sigh after she left the room. Honestly, everything becomes tension with her lately. Ina heard it anyway. That night, Easton climbed into bed after midnight, smelling faintly like expensive perfume and whiskey. Ina stared into the darkness. "Did you sleep with her?" Easton went still beside her, then laughed softly in disbelief. "You really want to do this right now?" "That's not an answer. You've become obsessive." "Obsessive." The word hit her like a slap. "You brought her into our home. She was helping Eli. You touched her at the fundraiser." Easton suddenly sat up. "For God's sake, Ina!" The irritation in his voice sounded almost rehearsed now. "You know what your problem is." Ina looked at him silently. "You create problems because you're unhappy with yourself." That one landed deep. Because once emotional abuse becomes sophisticated enough, it stops sounding cruel. It starts sounding believable. Easton rubbed his forehead dramatically. "You don't work anymore. You barely leave the house unless it involves the kids. You overthink everything." Ina whispered, "I gave up my career for this family, and nobody forced you to." The room went silent. Completely silent. Ina felt something inside her physically recoil, because that sentence erased 10 years of sacrifice in 5 seconds. School pickups, sleepless nights, birthday parties, homework, panic attacks, fevers, loneliness, everything. Reduced to a personal choice he no longer respected. "You used to admire me," Ina whispered. Easton looked away first. That was a long time ago. The cruelty of honesty hurt differently than lies. Ina turned toward the window because she refused to let him see her cry. But she could feel him emotionally withdrawing already, like he regretted even having the conversation. The next few weeks became unbearable. Celeste started appearing everywhere. At school events, at charity functions, at Easton's company gatherings, always perfectly dressed, always calm, always smiling, and Vivian treated her like royalty. One afternoon during Sunday brunch at Vivian's country club, Ina arrived late after taking Eli to urgent care for a sprained wrist. The moment she entered the dining room, she knew something was wrong. Celeste was sitting beside Easton, in Ina's seat. Vivian looked delighted. "Oh, good, you made it. Made it. Like she was a guest, not Easton's wife." Ina stood frozen while the conversations around the table slowed awkwardly. Celeste immediately stood. "Oh my God, I didn't realize." "No, no," Vivian interrupted smoothly. "Stay where you are. Ina won't mind." But she did mind. Humiliation spread hot beneath her skin. Easton finally spoke. "There's another chair. Another chair." Ina looked at him carefully, at the man she had loved enough to destroy herself for. And suddenly she saw it clearly. He was embarrassed by her, not because she had done something wrong, but because she reminded him of the version of himself that once needed love instead of admiration. Ina sat quietly at the far end of the table, like an outsider. Vivian spent the entire meal praising Celeste, Stanford Law at 24, made partner before 35. Travels constantly, so elegant. Every compliment sounded like an accusation toward Ina, and everyone knew it. Sophie poked quietly at her salad. Eli leaned closer to Ina. "Mom, yeah, baby, I don't like when Grandma talks to you like that." Ina nearly broke right there. But before she could answer, Vivian smiled across the table. "Sweetheart adults are just having conversations." "No," Eli whispered. "You're mean to Mom." The table went silent. Vivian's expression hardened instantly. "Children exposing truth always makes toxic adults uncomfortable," Eli Easton warned sharply. Ina immediately felt Eli shrink beside her. Fear. That was what Easton's voice created now. Fear. Vivian dabbed her lips delicately with a napkin. Children repeat what emotionally unstable parents say around them. Ina stared at her in disbelief. "You need to stop." Vivian lifted an eyebrow. "Stop what, trying to turn my children against me?" "Oh, Ina." Vivian leaned back calmly. Nobody has to turn people against someone who constantly plays victim. Easton said nothing. Again. Always nothing. And somehow that silence hurt worse than the insults themselves. Because betrayal from enemies is painful. But betrayal from the person who promised to protect you destroys your sense of reality. Later that evening, Ina stood outside Sophie's bedroom after overhearing something that shattered her completely. Sophie was talking on FaceTime with a friend. My grandma says Dad deserves someone who understands his world better. Ina stopped breathing. Then Sophie said quietly, I think maybe Mom just makes everybody stressed. The words nearly dropped Ina to her knees, not because Sophie meant to hurt her, but because the poison was working. Slowly, perfectly. Ina walked back downstairs numbly. Easton sat in his office scrolling through emails. She stood in the doorway for several seconds before speaking. Your mother is destroying my relationship with our children. Easton didn't even look up. You're overreacting. She's teaching them not to respect me. No, he replied coldly. They're growing up and noticing things on their own. Ina stared at him in horror. Do you hear yourself? Easton finally looked at her, and for the first time in their marriage, there was no love left in his eyes. Only annoyance, exhaustion, distance. Then he said the sentence that would haunt her for weeks afterward. Celeste would never create this much drama. Ina felt the air leave her lungs. There it was. Finally. Not hidden anymore. Not implied. Spoken aloud. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of the office she decorated for him, Ina realized they weren't just emotionally replacing her anymore. They were rehearsing life without her. Ina stopped crying 3 days after Easton said Celeste would never create this much drama. Not because she stopped hurting, because something colder replaced the pain. Clarity. The kind that arrives when love finally collapses under the weight of repeated humiliation. That Friday night rain slammed violently against the windows, while the Berry house sat wrapped in silence. Sophie and Eli were asleep upstairs. Vivian had finally gone home after spending 4 hours criticizing the floral arrangements for an upcoming charity luncheon. Easton walked into the kitchen around 11, carrying his laptop bag and exhaustion like armor. Ina stood by the counter in soft gray pajamas waiting. The moment he saw her expression, irritation flickered across his face. What now? Not hello, not how are you. What now? Ina studied him carefully, the expensive watch, the loosened tie, the emotional distance. You were with her again. Easton dropped his keys onto the marble counter harder than necessary. I'm not doing this tonight. Then when Ina asked quietly, because every time I try to talk to you, you act like I'm inconveniencing you. Easton opened the refrigerator. I work 12-hour days, Ina, and somehow still find time for Celeste. The silence afterward was sharp enough to cut skin. Easton shut the refrigerator slowly. There it is. There what is, the accusation. Ina laughed bitterly. You brought another woman into our home. She is a colleague. You touch her like she belongs to you. Easton rubbed his forehead. You've become impossible to talk to. That sentence almost made Ina doubt herself again. Almost, but not this time. Because emotionally manipulated people eventually learn something important. Confusion is often the point. I gave you everything, Ina whispered. Easton looked exhausted instead of moved. You chose that. No, she replied, voice trembling now. We chose this life together. Easton leaned against the counter. And somewhere along the way you stopped being yourself. Ina stared at him. What does that even mean? You used to challenge me. You used to care about things outside this house. The cruelty was breathtaking, because he was blaming her for the sacrifices he benefited from. You asked me to stay home with the kids. I never forced you. There it was again, the rewriting of history. As if she had independently decided to abandon her career while he built his empire uninterrupted. as if she had imagined all those conversations about family balance and shared priorities. "You know what hurts the most?" Ina asked softly. Easton looked away immediately. "You don't even sound guilty anymore." Something dark crossed his face then. Not shame, annoyance. "I'm tired of feeling like the villain because I'm unhappy." Ina physically froze. Unhappy, not remorseful, not conflicted. Unhappy. When did you become this cruel? Easton exhaled sharply. When did you become someone who lives entirely through motherhood? The sentence landed like a slap. Ina stared at him while years of sacrifice flashed through her mind. Breastfeeding at 3 a.m. while Easton slept before important meetings. Canceling promotions because his schedule mattered more. Moving to Connecticut because Vivian insisted Manhattan wasn't appropriate for raising children. Giving and giving and giving until nothing remained of herself outside wife and mother. And now he spoke about those sacrifices like flaws. "You think taking care of our children made me less valuable? I think you disappeared," Easton snapped. Ina's eyes burned instantly. "No, I loved you." Easton looked away, and somehow that hurt worse than yelling would have. Because people only avoid eye contact when they know the truth favors you. The kitchen fell silent except for the storm outside. Then Easton said quietly, "Celeste understands ambition." The room tilted. There it was, finally spoken aloud, not hidden behind lies anymore. Ina felt humiliation rise so violently inside her chest she thought she might actually collapse. "You love her." Easton hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. "I don't know." The answer shattered something permanent inside her. Not because he loved someone else, but because he no longer loved her enough to protect her from hearing it. Ina nodded slowly. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of screaming, instead of begging, instead of breaking apart the way he clearly expected, she became calm, terrifyingly calm. Easton noticed immediately. "Ina, no." She interrupted softly. "I just need you to answer one question honestly." He looked wary now. "When did you stop respecting me?" Easton opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was no safe answer, and they both knew it. Finally he muttered, "You changed." Ina smiled sadly. "No, I sacrificed." Another silence. Then Easton said something that would replay inside Ina's mind for months. "You made motherhood your entire personality." The cruelty of it stole the air from her lungs, because he spoke about raising their children like it was embarrassing, like love itself was something beneath him now. Ina turned away before he could see the tears finally spill down her face, and in that moment she understood something devastating. Easton didn't just want another woman. He wanted a version of life untouched by responsibility. A woman who reflected success instead of sacrifice. A woman who admired him instead of needing him emotionally. And suddenly Ina realized she had spent years shrinking herself for a man who now despised the very sacrifices that built his comfort. Easton picked up his laptop bag again. "I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight." Of course you are, Ina thought. Running away was easier than accountability. After he left, Ina stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. The storm outside had softened into steady rain. The house felt enormous, empty, cold. She slowly reached for her phone, then opened the voice memo app and replayed the entire conversation she had secretly recorded. Every cruel sentence, every confession, every moment of emotional manipulation. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, from awakening, because hearing the conversation back removed the emotional fog. Easton sounded cruel, dismissive, arrogant, and for the first time in years, Ina stopped blaming herself for his unhappiness. Around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, she wandered into the small storage room beside the upstairs office. Boxes lined the walls, old files, forgotten pieces of herself. Ina knelt beside one marked career. Inside were old notebooks, business cards, conference badges, strategy presentations, and photographs from the version of herself she barely recognized now. Confident, sharp-eyed, alive. Then she found the email printout. Claire Monroe, senior partner at Monroe and Pierce Consulting, 3 years old. The subject line read, "Your place here still exists if you ever want it." Ina stared at the page while tears blurred her vision. She remembered ignoring the offer because Easton said the children needed stability, because Vivian claimed working mothers created emotional distance, because she believed love meant sacrifice. Slowly, Ina stood up, walked downstairs, opened her laptop, and after staring at the blinking cursor for nearly 10 minutes, she finally typed, "Hi, Claire. I know it's been a long time, but I was wondering, are you still hiring?" Ina hit send before fear could stop her. Then she sat alone in the dark kitchen listening to the rain outside while one terrifying realization settled into her chest. For the first time in years, she was no longer thinking about saving her marriage. She was thinking about saving herself. Claire Monroe responded 14 minutes later. Of course she did. Claire had always been terrifyingly efficient. The email was short. "Call me tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't disappear again." Ina stared at the screen for a long time after reading it. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her like she still existed outside her marriage. The next morning, she sat in her car outside a quiet coffee shop in downtown Stamford, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers hurt. She almost drove away twice. Not because she was unsure about Claire, because she was unsure about herself. The old Ina Barry felt like someone she had invented. Confident women didn't get emotionally erased inside their own homes. Confident women didn't allow another woman to slowly replace them while pretending everything was fine. But when Ina walked inside the cafe, Claire Monroe stood immediately, and the look on her face shattered something painful open inside Ina. Not judgment, concern. Real concern. "My God," Claire whispered. Ina tried to smile. "I know. I look exhausted." "No," Claire said quietly. "You look diminished." That word nearly made Ina cry, because diminished was exactly what had happened to her. Claire hugged her tightly before either woman sat down. For the next hour, Ina told her everything, not just the affair, the emotional erosion, Vivian's manipulation, Easton's cruelty, the children, the humiliation, all the tiny cuts that eventually became emotional bleeding. Claire listened without interrupting. And when Ina finally finished, Claire leaned back slowly. "He's been psychologically starving you." Ina looked down at her coffee. "That sounds dramatic." "No," Claire replied sharply. "It sounds accurate." Silence settled between them. Then Claire asked softly, "When was the last time someone made you feel powerful?" Ina almost laughed. "I honestly don't remember." Claire stared at her for several seconds. "You built million-dollar strategy models at 30 years old. Men twice your age were intimidated by you. That was another life." "No," Claire said firmly. "That was another environment." Something about the sentence stayed with Ina, because maybe she hadn't become weak. Maybe she had simply been surrounded by people who benefited from her feeling small. Claire opened her laptop. "I still have your old portfolio." Ina blinked in surprise. "You kept it." "You were one of the best strategists I've ever worked with." The words hit harder than they should have, because Easton hadn't admired her intelligence in years. And hearing someone remember her value felt almost disorienting. Claire pulled up old presentations Ina had designed. market expansion plans, corporate restructuring frameworks, acquisition strategies. The slides looked sharp, elegant, brilliant. Iana barely recognized the woman who created them. "You disappeared after Sophie was born," Claire said carefully. Ina nodded. "Easton's career exploded around that time, and yours vanished. The bluntness hurt because it was true." Claire leaned forward slightly. "Ina, women like Vivian only respect power. That's why she hates you." Ina frowned faintly. "Hates me? She hates that Easton once loved you more than he needed her approval." The observation unsettled Ina deeply, because suddenly years of Vivian's behavior started making horrible sense. The criticism, the competition, the constant undermining. Vivian never treated Ina like family. She treated her like a threat. "What do I even do now?" Ina whispered. Claire's expression hardened. "You stop reacting emotionally and start preparing strategically." Something shifted inside Ina hearing that. Preparation, strategy, control, words she used to understand fluently before survival consumed her entire identity. Claire slid a business card across the table. Divorce attorney, best in Manhattan. Ina's stomach tightened instantly. "I'm not ready for that." Claire nodded calmly. "Fine, then prepare anyway." That sentence followed Ina home like a shadow. Prepare anyway. When she walked back into the house that afternoon, laughter echoed from the kitchen. Vivian again. Of course. Easton stood near the island while Vivian flipped through luxury vacation brochures. "We should do St. Bartholomew in January," Vivian said. "The children need better winter exposure." Then her eyes landed on Ina. "Well, you look surprisingly alive today." Ina set her purse down quietly. "Coffee shop meetings tend to help with that." Easton looked up immediately. With who interesting? He hadn't sounded curious about her life in years. Claire Monroe. A flicker crossed his face. Recognition. Concern. Maybe even discomfort. Vivian laughed lightly. "Oh, please. Ina isn't going back into consulting." The old Ina would have shrunk under that sentence. This version simply asked, "And why not?" Vivian blinked. "Because confidence always shocks people who benefited from your insecurity." Easton stepped in carefully. "The kids need stability." Ina looked directly at him. "The kids need a mother who's mentally healthy." Silence. Tiny. Sharp. Vivian recovered first. Working mothers always convince themselves they're empowering their children while emotionally neglecting them. Ina almost answered emotionally. Almost. But Claire's voice echoed in her head. Stop reacting. Start observing. So instead, Ina smiled faintly. "You spent most of Easton's childhood with nannies." Vivian's expression froze. Easton looked startled. Good. For once, somebody else could feel uncomfortable. Vivian set her wine glass down carefully. "I sacrificed for my husband's success." "So did I," Ina replied softly. The room went quiet, because everyone knew the difference. Vivian had been rewarded for her sacrifices. Ina had been erased by hers. That night, after everyone went upstairs, Ina quietly entered Easton's office. Not emotionally, strategically. She sat in his leather chair and slowly opened drawers. Financial files, investment records, tax folders. At first, everything looked normal. Then she noticed repeated transfers under a consulting shell corporation. Whitmore Strategic Holdings. Her pulse slowed instead of racing, because pain was beginning to transform into clarity now. She photographed everything carefully with her phone. Transfer amounts, dates, private account references. Then one number made her stomach tighten. $280,000, transferred 3 weeks earlier. Ina leaned back slowly. This wasn't just an affair anymore. Easton was hiding money. The office door suddenly opened. Ina looked up instantly. Easton stood there. For one dangerous second, neither of them spoke. Then his eyes moved to the papers in her hands. "What are you doing?" His voice was colder than she had ever heard it. Ina stood carefully. "I could ask you the same thing." Easton walked forward slowly. "That's confidential business information transferred to Celeste's company." The silence afterward felt explosive. Easton's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're looking at." Ina almost smiled, because manipulative people always say that when the truth becomes visible. "What exactly am I misunderstanding?" she asked quietly. Easton stepped closer, and for the first time in weeks, Ina noticed something unexpected in his expression. Not arrogance, fear. Tiny, controlled, but definitely fear. And suddenly Ina realized something important. Easton wasn't just emotionally losing control of her anymore, he was losing control of the narrative. Easton didn't yell after finding Ina in his office. That was what made the moment unsettling. He became controlled, careful, like a man realizing brute force would no longer work. "You shouldn't be going through private files," he said quietly. Ina held his gaze. "You shouldn't be hiding money." The silence stretched. Easton stepped forward and calmly took the folder from her hands. "It's business. With Celeste, you're making assumptions." Ina almost laughed. That phrase again, assumptions, as if reality itself became invalid whenever it threatened him. But something inside her had changed now. She no longer needed him to confess in order to trust herself. Easton watched her carefully. "You've been acting differently lately. Differently. Not stronger, not clearer. Just inconvenient." Ina crossed her arms. "I stopped pretending everything is normal." Easton sighed heavily. "You're turning this family into a war zone." The manipulation nearly impressed her, because somehow he had managed to position himself as the victim while carrying on an affair and emotionally dismantling his wife. But before Ina could answer, soft footsteps echoed in the hallway upstairs. Eli. The 8-year-old stood frozen near the staircase in dinosaur pajamas, clutching a stuffed shark, wide-eyed, nervous. Children always knew when adults were lying, even if they couldn't explain how. Easton's tone immediately softened. "Buddy, what are you doing awake?" Eli hesitated. "I heard yelling." "We weren't yelling," Easton replied quickly, but Eli looked at Ina instead. Only Ina. Like he trusted her version of reality more, and that broke something inside Easton's carefully controlled atmosphere. Ina knelt beside her son gently. "Bad dream." Eli nodded. Without another word, Ina picked him up and carried him upstairs. Easton stayed downstairs, probably relieved, because he no longer knew how to comfort his own children emotionally unless an audience was watching. Inside Eli's room, soft blue nightlights glowed against the walls. Ina tucked him carefully into bed, but Eli kept holding onto her sleeve. "Mom." "Yeah, baby." He looked scared to ask his question. And that terrified her more than anything. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" The word hit her like ice water. "No matter what happens," Ina said softly, "you and Sophie will always be loved." That wasn't an answer. Eli knew it too. Children understand avoidance instinctively. He stared at the ceiling for several seconds before whispering, "Grandma says Dad deserves someone happier." Ina felt actual physical pain in her chest, because Vivian hadn't just been criticizing her. She had been emotionally recruiting the children into the narrative, carefully, repeatedly, like poison in tiny doses. "What else does Grandma say?" Eli looked guilty immediately. "Mom." "It's okay." He swallowed hard. She says you cry too much. Ina closed her eyes briefly, not because the insult hurt, but because no child should ever carry adult cruelty like this. She says, Eli's voice became smaller. Dad works hard and you make him stressed. There it was again. The story Vivian kept feeding them. Your mother is the problem. Your father is trapped. And suddenly Ina understood why Sophie had become emotionally distant lately. Why Eli sometimes watched her carefully after arguments. The children were trying to figure out who to believe, and nobody had protected them from the manipulation, not even Easton. Especially not Easton. Ina smoothed Eli's hair gently. Listen to me carefully, okay? He nodded. Adults can have problems with each other without one person being bad, but Grandma says I know what Grandma says. Ina's voice stayed calm somehow. But you never have to stop loving someone just because another person tells you to. Eli stared at her silently, then tears suddenly filled his eyes. She's mean to you. The words shattered Ina completely. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. And her little boy had noticed long before she admitted it to herself. Ina climbed into bed beside him carefully. I'm sorry you've had to hear all this. Eli buried his face against her shoulder. I don't like when Dad gets quiet. That sentence lingered painfully, because children feared emotional withdrawal more than yelling sometimes. Easton's silence had become punishment inside the house, and everyone felt it. The next morning, Sophie barely spoke during breakfast. She scrolled through her phone while Vivian criticized the school's new arts director from across the table. Easton read financial news on his iPad. The entire family looked normal. That was the disturbing part. Toxic households often look polished in daylight. Celeste is joining us Saturday, Vivian announced casually while spreading cream cheese on toast. Ina looked up slowly. For what the museum fundraiser? We already discussed this, Easton added without emotion. No, Ina thought. You informed me. There's a difference. Sophie finally spoke quietly. Celeste is nice. The sentence landed harder than expected. Vivian smiled immediately. She's very sophisticated. Ina watched her daughter carefully. What do you like about her? Sophie shrugged. She listens. The answer punched straight through Ina's chest, because listening had become difficult lately. Ina had spent so much energy surviving humiliation that emotional presence became harder. Guilt crawled instantly through her stomach. Vivian noticed. Of course she did. She's very patient with children, Vivian added. Then came the deliberate pause. Some women are naturally nurturing. Ina almost admired how strategic Vivian's cruelty was. Always indirect enough to deny later. Always sharp enough to wound. Easton remained silent. Again, always silence. After breakfast, Sophie left for school early with friends while Easton disappeared into meetings. Vivian lingered intentionally. I worry about the children, she said while reorganizing flowers nobody asked her to touch. Ina folded laundry mechanically. You mean you enjoy controlling them? Vivian smiled faintly. You've become defensive lately. You've become comfortable disrespecting me. Vivian turned toward her slowly. No, Ina. You simply stopped being useful. The sentence stunned the air out of the room. Useful, not loved, not valued, useful. Vivian stepped closer. Easton needs someone who elevates him, not someone emotionally clinging to him. Ina stared at her. Why do you hate me so much for the first time? Vivian answered honestly. Because he used to choose you over me. The confession hung between them heavily. Then Vivian continued, but eventually men grow tired of emotionally needy women. Ina felt anger rise violently now. Not shame anymore. Anger. You helped destroy this marriage. Vivian tilted her head calmly. No, I simply exposed the cracks that were already there. Later that afternoon, while organizing Sophie's backpack, Ina accidentally found folded notebook paper shoved inside a side pocket. At first, she thought it was homework. Then she opened it. Her stomach dropped instantly. The paper was covered in shaky handwriting. Things Grandma says about Mom. Ina sat down slowly. Mom used to be prettier. Dad deserves peace. Mom is too emotional. Celeste understands Dad better. Don't become weak like Mom. Ina stopped breathing. There were little check marks beside some sentences, like Sophie had been trying to decide whether they were true. Tears blurred Ina's vision immediately, because this wasn't accidental anymore. This was systematic emotional damage. And suddenly she realized something horrifying. Vivian hadn't just been replacing her socially, she had been trying to replace her emotionally in her own children's minds. Then another realization hit her. Sophie had written the list down because she was confused, trying to process it, trying to survive it. Ina pressed the paper against her chest while rage and heartbreak collided inside her. And for the first time, she stopped thinking about saving her marriage at all. Now she was thinking about protecting her children. The night of the Hartford Children's Foundation Gala arrived wrapped in cold November rain and quiet tension. Ina stood alone inside her bedroom, staring at herself in the mirror, while the Barry mansion buzzed downstairs with caterers, drivers, and last-minute calls. For years, gala nights had felt like performances. Smile correctly, stand beside Easton, laugh softly, look beautiful but not threatening, elegant but forgettable. Tonight felt different, because for the first time in a long time, Ina was no longer dressing to be chosen. She was dressing to remember herself. The black satin gown hugged her figure perfectly. Minimal jewelry, hair swept back cleanly, makeup soft but sharp enough to reveal the confidence slowly returning beneath months of emotional exhaustion. When Ina walked downstairs, the entire foyer fell briefly silent. Even Vivian looked startled. Easton turned from the staircase, and for one dangerous second, he actually looked at her. Really looked. Not with irritation, not obligation, shock. Like he suddenly remembered the woman he married before he spent years convincing her she was ordinary. Vivian recovered first. Well, she said lightly, that's certainly ambitious. Ina smiled calmly, and yet somehow still appropriate. The tiny hit landed perfectly. Easton's jaw shifted slightly. Good. Let him feel uncomfortable for once. The gala took place inside a luxury glass ballroom overlooking downtown Hartford, glowing gold against the rainy skyline. Politicians, executives, old money families, and investors filled the room, dressed in wealth and carefully curated charm. Normally, Ina hated these events. Tonight, she studied people the way she used to in corporate negotiations, observing, reading, calculating. And something terrifying began happening. People responded to her differently, not because she changed overnight, because she stopped shrinking herself. Within 20 minutes, its 3 executives had introduced themselves to her independently. A nonprofit director asked for her opinion on expansion strategy. A hedge fund manager laughed too hard at one of her comments. Easton noticed all of it. So did Celeste. Especially Celeste. The other woman arrived in silver silk wrapped around confidence and expensive perfume, immediately sliding beside Easton like she belonged there. Vivian looked thrilled. There's our star. Ina sipped champagne slowly. Interesting choice of wording. Not guest, not colleague. Star. Celeste approached Ina with a polite smile sharpened by competition underneath. You look incredible tonight. So do you, Ina replied smoothly, but unlike before, Ina no longer sounded intimidated, and Celeste noticed. Women always notice energy shifts first. You seem different lately, Celeste observed carefully. Ina tilted her head slightly. Do I? Yes. There was something probing beneath the conversation now, as if Celeste expected emotional collapse and felt unsettled not finding it. Before Ina could answer, a deep male voice interrupted warmly. Ina Barry. She turned and immediately recognized Richard Hale, CEO of Hale Capital Partners, one of the most respected investors in Connecticut. 10 years older than Easton, sharp-eyed, intelligent, the kind of man who noticed everything and missed nothing. We met years ago at the Manhattan Strategy Summit, Richard said. Ina blinked in surprise. You remember that you dismantled an acquisition proposal in under 6 minutes. Hard thing to forget. Easton went visibly still beside them because he had forgotten. Or worse, he remembered and stopped valuing it. Richard smiled warmly. I heard you disappeared from consulting. Ina felt Easton watching her carefully now. I took time for family. Richard's expression shifted subtly, the look successful women instantly recognize from other successful people. Ah, one of those stories. What a waste, Richard said honestly. Celeste crossed her arms slightly. Motherhood isn't a waste. No, Richard replied smoothly. But losing brilliant women because society rewards their exhaustion certainly is. Silence. Heavy. Vivian looked deeply irritated already. Good. For the next hour, Ina moved through conversations effortlessly, not performing, remembering. She discussed market instability with investors, corrected a nonprofit board member's flawed expansion model, made an entire group laugh during dinner, and slowly, Easton became quieter because people were seeing Ina, not as his wife, as herself. That terrified him more than her tears ever did. Meanwhile, Celeste's polished confidence started cracking in subtle ways. She interrupted Ina twice unnecessarily, corrected small details nobody cared about, laughed too loudly at Easton's comments. Competitive women become uneasy when the wife stops looking broken. Vivian finally cornered Ina near the balcony. You're certainly enjoying attention tonight. Ina leaned lightly against the railing. So are you. Vivian smiled thinly. You shouldn't confuse temporary attention with value, and you shouldn't confuse control with love. For the first time in years, Vivian looked genuinely surprised, because Ina no longer sounded wounded. She sounded awake. You think Easton will suddenly admire ambition again? Vivian asked quietly. Ina looked directly at her. No, I think he's starting to realize what he destroyed. Vivian's eyes sharpened instantly. Before she could answer, Richard Hale approached again, carrying 2 champagne glasses. I'm stealing Ina for 5 minutes, he announced easily. Vivian clearly hated that. Excellent. Richard guided Ina toward a quieter lounge area overlooking the ballroom. You know, he said casually, your husband looks nervous tonight. Ina gave a small, humorless laugh. He usually looks confident. Not around men who respect you. The observation stunned her slightly. Richard sat across from her. I did some business with Easton's firm recently. Something in his tone changed. Subtle. Careful. Ina noticed immediately. What kind of business? Richard studied her for a moment. You really don't know what's happening, do you? Her stomach tightened. Happening with what? Richard lowered his voice. Easton's company has liquidity issues. The room suddenly felt colder. What? There's talk of internal concern, aggressive transfers, unstable positioning. Ina's pulse slowed instead of racing now. Interesting. Pain had sharpened her instincts, and Celeste Richards' eyes flickered carefully. She's tied to some of the consulting structures being questioned. There it was. Confirmation. Not emotional suspicion anymore. Reality. Richard leaned forward slightly. I'm only telling you this because I remember who you used to be, and because smart women often stay loyal long after men stop deserving it. The sentence settled painfully inside her, because it was true. Ina had stayed loyal through neglect, humiliation, emotional abandonment, and betrayal. Not because Easton deserved it, because she believed endurance made love noble. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Easton watched them. Watched Richard Hale speaking intensely to Ina. Watched Ina smiling calmly. Watched powerful people treating her like someone important again. And for the first time in months, Easton looked threatened. Not by losing control of the marriage, by losing control of the narrative he built about her. The tired wife, the emotional burden, the woman who became small. Because suddenly everyone else in the room seemed to see exactly what he spent years trying to diminish. Value. When Ina finally returned toward the ballroom, Celeste intercepted her near the staircase. You seem very comfortable tonight. The tension beneath her smile was obvious now. Ina met her gaze calmly. So do you. Celeste hesitated, then quietly asked, Are you planning something? Ina almost smiled. Because guilty people always sense consequences before innocent people do. I'm finally paying attention, Ina replied softly. Then she walked away, leaving Celeste standing motionless beneath the ballroom lights, while somewhere across the room, Easton watched his wife transform back into the woman he once fell in love with. Only now, she no longer needed his approval to feel powerful. Easton came home furious 3 days after the gala. Ina heard the front door slam hard enough to shake the framed photographs lining the hallway. Not long ago, that sound would have filled her with anxiety. Now it simply confirmed something was unraveling. She sat at the kitchen island helping Eli with math homework, while Sophie worked quietly beside them with headphones on. The atmosphere inside the house had changed lately. The children stayed closer to Ina now, especially after the gala, especially after they noticed their mother smiling again. Fear weakens children, but confidence calms them. Easton stormed into the kitchen, still wearing his overcoat tie loosened violently at the collar. Kids! Upstairs! His tone was sharp enough that Sophie immediately stiffened. Eli looked frightened. Ina set down her pen calmly. It's okay. Finish your homework in my office, sweetheart. The children disappeared upstairs quickly. The second they were gone, Easton turned toward her. What the hell did you do? There it was. Not hello. Not explanation. Accusation. Ina leaned back slightly in her chair. That depends. What are you talking about? Easton laughed once. Cold, humorless. Don't do that. Do what? Act innocent. Interesting. Men like Easton always assumed calm women were dangerous because emotional women had been easier to control. He threw a folder onto the counter. Audit notices, internal reviews, financial compliance requests. Ina glanced at the papers slowly, then looked back up. Look serious. Easton stared at her carefully. You spoke to Richard Hale. So that was it. His ego was bleeding. Briefly, what did you tell him? The truth. Easton's jaw tightened instantly. And what exactly is your version of the truth these days? Ina almost smiled. Her version. As if facts themselves became negotiable whenever accountability entered the room. That your company is under investigation, she said quietly. That you're moving money through Celeste's consulting structures. That you've been lying to me for months. Easton slammed his palm against the counter. Lower your voice. No. The single word stunned both of them. Because Ina never used to say no. Not clearly, not firmly. Easton stared at her for several long seconds. Then his tone changed. Softer, controlled again. You don't understand how corporate restructuring works. Ina folded her hands together calmly. I understand hidden transfers perfectly well. The silence thickened. Easton looked exhausted now, not remorseful, cornered. There are things happening you know nothing about. Then explain them. I don't owe you business explanations. Ina tilted her head slightly. But you expected me to sacrifice my entire career for yours. That landed. She saw it. Tiny flicker. Guilt, quickly buried beneath irritation. Easton walked toward the liquor cabinet. You've changed. Ina watched him pour whiskey. No, she replied softly. I stopped absorbing blame for your behavior. The sentence visibly unsettled him, because manipulative people rely on emotional confusion to survive. And Ina was becoming dangerously clear. Later that night, after Easton locked himself inside his office for 2 hours making frantic calls, Ina sat beside Claire Monroe inside a quiet Manhattan restaurant reviewing documents. Claire looked impressed. These transfer records are ugly. Ina stirred her tea absently. How ugly, Claire leaned back. Potential fraud, ugly. The word made Ina's stomach twist, not because she wanted Easton destroyed, because part of her still struggled to accept how far he had fallen. Claire studied her carefully. You still love him. Ina laughed softly. I think I love who he used to be. That man may not exist anymore. The honesty hurt because it felt true. Claire opened another file. And Celeste is deeply involved. Ina stared down at the financial reports, repeated payments, private consulting structures, corporate expense manipulation. Do you think she knows? Claire's expression darkened. Oh, she absolutely knows. Silence settled heavily. Then Claire asked quietly, what about the children? That question changed everything. Because until recently, Ina had still viewed the marriage as the center of the crisis. Now she understood something more important. The children were absorbing all of it. The tension, the manipulation, the emotional instability, and worst of all, the example. What if Sophie starts believing this is what love looks like? Ina whispered. Claire didn't answer immediately, because some fears are too devastating for quick comfort. The next week, Easton became increasingly volatile. Not outwardly explosive, worse, unpredictable. Some mornings he acted almost affectionate toward the children. Other days he barely acknowledged anyone. His company's internal audit was spreading fast now. Executives whispering, meetings extending late into the night, phone calls taken behind closed doors, and for the first time in years. Vivian looked nervous. Ina noticed it immediately during Sunday brunch. Vivian kept checking Easton's expression carefully. Everything will settle down, she said too quickly. People exaggerate these things. Easton barely touched his food. Meanwhile, Sophie quietly passed Ina the orange juice without being asked. A tiny gesture, but meaningful. Children return emotionally to safety slowly. Eli glanced between the adults nervously. Dad Easton rubbed his forehead. What are you mad at, Mom? The room froze. Vivian immediately stepped in. Sweetheart, adult conversations are complicated. But Eli ignored her completely. He kept looking at Easton. Because children crave direct honesty instinctively. Easton sighed heavily. Nobody. But even the lie sounded tired now. Sophie finally spoke quietly. You always seem angry after talking to Grandma. Vivian's face changed instantly. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Sophie shrank slightly. Ina immediately intervened. Nobody's attacking you. Vivian turned toward her sharply. Oh, please! You've poisoned these children against this family. Ina almost laughed. Because toxic people always accuse others of the damage they created themselves. Easton suddenly stood. That's enough. Everyone fell silent. But he wasn't looking at Vivian. He was looking at Ina. "You've created tension in this house for months." There it was again. Blame redirection. Predictable now, but before Ina could answer, Sophie whispered something that changed the entire atmosphere. "No, Dad. Grandma did." Silence crashed across the dining room. Vivian looked horrified. Easton looked stunned. And Sophie immediately looked terrified after saying it aloud. Because children raised around manipulation become afraid of truth itself. Vivian recovered first. "Sophie, sweetheart?" No, Sophie interrupted shakily. Then she looked at Ina. Actually looked at her. With guilt. "With the things you say about Mom." Ina felt tears sting instantly. Not because Sophie defended her, because the child sounded scared while doing it. Vivian's voice hardened. "I have never spoken badly about your mother." Eli suddenly looked down at his plate. Too quickly. Ina noticed. So did Sophie. Something passed silently between the siblings. Fear, secrets, knowledge. Easton pinched the bridge of his nose. "Can we stop doing this in front of the kids?" Ina stared at him in disbelief, still protecting appearances, still more worried about discomfort than truth. That night, after everyone went upstairs, Ina found Eli sitting alone in the upstairs hallway, clutching his tablet tightly. "You okay, baby?" Eli looked nervous immediately. Then he whispered, "I have to show you something." Ina's heartbeat slowed. Not fast, slow, the way it does before life changes permanently. Eli opened an audio file carefully. "I recorded it because Sophie was crying," he whispered. Ina frowned slightly. Recorded what Eli pressed play. And suddenly Vivian's voice filled the hallway speakers cold and clear. Those children would be better off without Ina. She's emotionally weak, and weak women ruin families. Ina stopped breathing. Then Vivian's voice continued. "Easton deserves someone sophisticated, someone like Celeste." A sharp sound escaped Ina's throat before she could stop it, not a sob, something deeper. Because hearing cruelty directly always destroys denial permanently. Eli looked terrified now. "I'm sorry." Ina immediately pulled him into her arms. "No, sweetheart, no. You did nothing wrong." But while she held her son tightly against her chest, one terrifying realization settled inside her completely. Vivian hadn't just damaged her marriage. She had emotionally endangered her children, and Ina was finally done staying quiet about it. Ina barely slept after hearing the recording, not because she was shocked anymore. Shock had already burned itself out weeks ago. This was something colder, final. She sat alone in the dark downstairs living room at 3 a.m, replaying Vivian's voice over and over through headphones while rain whispered against the windows. Weak women ruin families. Easton deserves someone like Celeste. Those children would be better off without Ina. Every sentence tightened something inside her chest. Not grief anymore. Resolve. For years, Ina had convinced herself she could survive humiliation if it protected the children from instability. But now she understood the truth. The instability was already inside the house, and it was poisoning them slowly. By sunrise, Ina had made a decision. At 9:30 that morning, she sat inside a Manhattan law office across from Danielle Mercer, one of the most feared divorce attorneys in New York. Danielle read the transcripts quietly while tapping a manicured nail against the desk. Then she removed her glasses. "Well," she said calmly, "your husband and his mother are idiots." Ina almost laughed from exhaustion. Is that the professional legal opinion? It's the honest one. Danielle leaned forward. "You have evidence of emotional manipulation around the children. Hidden financial activity, possible infidelity, and recorded verbal abuse." Hearing it summarized so clinically made Ina feel strange. Because toxic environments become normalized when you live inside them too long, Danielle continued. The most important thing now is control. The word settled heavily. Control. Easton and Vivian had controlled the emotional environment for years, the narrative, the guilt, the shame. Not anymore. What do I do? Ina asked quietly. Danielle's expression sharpened. You stop reacting emotionally and start protecting yourself legally. The next few hours passed in a blur of strategy. Financial separation, custody preparation, documentation timelines, emergency protections. Ina signed papers with trembling hands while trying not to think about the fact that she was dismantling the life she once fought desperately to preserve. By the time she returned home that evening, emotional exhaustion sat heavy inside her bones. But something else existed too. Calm, not peace, preparedness. The house was unusually quiet until she walked into the kitchen and heard Vivian's voice. Honestly, Easton, the children need structure right now. Ina is emotionally unstable. Ina stopped walking. Easton stood near the counter rubbing his temples. Mom, lower your voice. She's isolating the children from us. Interesting. Projection again. Ina stepped into the room slowly. I'm standing right here. Vivian turned dramatically. Oh, good. Maybe you can explain why Sophie was crying this morning. Ina stared at her. You mean after years of listening to you insult her mother? Easton's expression darkened instantly. What are you talking about? Ina almost answered immediately. Almost. But Danielle's voice echoed in her head. Never reveal all your evidence emotionally. So instead, Ina remained calm. The children are overwhelmed. Vivian scoffed. No, they're confused because you've become erratic. There it was. The beginning of the narrative, emotionally unstable, unpredictable. The classic setup toxic families use before custody battles. Easton finally looked at Ina carefully. You've been talking to lawyers. Not a question. A realization. Ina held his gaze. Yes. The silence that followed felt explosive. Vivian looked genuinely offended. You're planning to destroy this family. Ina laughed softly. The audacity nearly amazed her. Destroy! As if the family hadn't already been emotionally shattered. I'm trying to protect my children. Easton stepped forward immediately. From what Ina looked directly at him. From people who teach them their mother is weak and disposable. Easton's jaw tightened. No one said that. The lie came too fast, too practiced. Ina almost pulled out the recording immediately. But no, not yet. Danielle had been clear. Timing matters. Instead, Ina said quietly, Sophie wrote down the things Vivian says about me. For the first time, Easton looked shaken. Actually shaken. Vivian recovered quickly. Children misunderstand adult conversations. No, Ina replied softly. Children internalize them. Easton suddenly became cold again. So what? You're filing for divorce now. The bitterness in his voice almost sounded offended, as if he still expected her to remain loyal no matter how cruel things became. I'm preparing myself. For what? Ina met his eyes steadily. For the possibility that this marriage cannot be saved. The words visibly hit him, not because he loved her enough to fear losing her emotionally, because consequences were becoming real. Vivian stood abruptly. This is exactly why Easton has been unhappy. Ina slowly turned toward her. No, Easton has been unhappy because he mistakes admiration for love. Silence crashed through this kitchen. Vivian looked furious. Easton looked stunned. Good. Let truth become uncomfortable. Upstairs a door creaked softly. Sophie, listening. Again. Children in toxic households become silent witnesses long before adults realize it. Iana immediately softened her tone. "Sophie, sweetheart, come downstairs." Slow footsteps followed. Sophie appeared at the staircase looking nervous, Eli behind her. Always behind her now. The siblings had become emotionally protective of each other lately. Another warning sign. Easton forced calm instantly. "Hey, guys." But the children looked at Ina first. Always Ina now, because emotional safety creates gravity. Vivian smiled too brightly. "We were just talking." "No," Sophie whispered quietly. "You were fighting again." The word again settled heavily across the room, because children always notice patterns adults try to minimize. Easton crouched slightly. "Mom and Dad are just stressed." Sophie looked directly at him. Because of Celeste, the room stopped breathing. Vivian immediately stood. "That's inappropriate." But Easton had gone pale. Sophie realized it too. And suddenly Ina saw something heartbreaking happen in real time. Her daughter stopped doubting herself. Children know truth instinctively once adults fail to hide reactions. "I knew it," Sophie whispered. "No," Easton said quickly. "Sweetheart, it's complicated." Complicated! The favorite word of guilty adults. Eli suddenly grabbed Ina's hand tightly. "Are we gonna lose Mom?" The question shattered every remaining piece of restraint inside her. Ina knelt immediately. "You will never lose me." Tears filled Eli's eyes. "Promise, I promise." Easton looked away, and that hurt more than anything, because he couldn't even make the same promise confidently anymore. That night after the children went upstairs, Easton cornered Ina in the hallway outside their bedroom. "You're turning them against me." Ina stared at him in disbelief. "No," she said quietly. "Your behavior is." Easton lowered his voice sharply. "You think courts are going to look kindly on emotional instability?" There it was. Finally. The threat. Not direct enough to quote legally, but clear enough to understand. Ina felt ice spread slowly through her chest. "You're threatening custody. I'm protecting my children." The hypocrisy almost made her laugh. "You barely protect them emotionally now." Easton's expression hardened completely. "You are not taking them away from me." Ina looked at him calmly. "I'm not the one who made this house unsafe." For a moment, real anger flashed across his face. Dangerous anger. Then he stepped back suddenly like he realized he'd revealed too much. "Do whatever you want," he muttered, and walked away. But after he disappeared into the guest room, Ina stood alone in the hallway with one horrifying realization settling deep inside her. This was no longer just emotional betrayal. Easton was preparing for war, and thanks to Vivian, he genuinely believed Ina was the weaker parent. Vivian announced the family dinner like it was a royal event. Saturday, 7 o'clock sharp, immediate family only. Ina knew exactly what it was, a performance. Vivian had always preferred public humiliation because witnesses made manipulation feel legitimate. And now that Easton's company was under scrutiny and rumors were spreading through their social circle, Vivian wanted control back. Control of the narrative. Control of the family. Control of the children. The dining room looked immaculate that night. Crystal glasses, white orchids, silver candle holders reflecting warm golden light across polished marble. Everything expensive, everything emotionally rotten. Ina arrived downstairs wearing dark emerald silk and a calm expression that irritated Vivian immediately. Easton noticed too. His eyes lingered on her for a second longer than usual. Not love, confusion, because emotionally broken women were easier for him to predict, and Ina no longer looked broken. Sophie and Eli entered quietly behind her. The children had changed over the past few weeks. Sophie watched adults carefully now before speaking. Eli stayed physically close to Ina whenever Vivian entered a room. Children adapt to emotional danger faster than adults realize. Vivian smiled too brightly once everyone sat down. I'm glad we're finally having a peaceful family evening. Ina almost laughed. Peaceful, like emotional abuse disappeared when served beside expensive wine. Dinner began stiffly. Easton barely touched his food. Vivian filled silence with passive-aggressive commentary about schools, social reputation, and family stability. Then came the attack. Predictable, strategic, cruel. Vivian set down her wine glass delicately. You know, she said lightly, children need emotionally consistent mothers during difficult times. Ina continued cutting her salmon calmly. Sophie stiffened immediately. Eli looked down at his plate. Easton closed his eyes briefly. There it is. There it is, Ina thought. Vivian continued smoothly. Instability from a mother can create lifelong emotional confusion. Ina looked up slowly. Are you speaking generally, or are you trying to insult me again? Vivian sighed dramatically. Oh, Ina, not everything is about you, but it always was. Every sentence had been designed to undermine her. For years. Easton finally spoke. Mom, maybe let's not do this tonight. Not stop. Not apologize. Just avoid discomfort again. Vivian ignored him completely. I'm simply concerned about the children. Sophie suddenly pushed food around her plate harder, tiny movement, but Ina noticed. The child was anxious already. Vivian continued, children deserve mothers who inspire security instead of emotional exhaustion. And there it was, the same poison, over and over until children start believing it. Ina opened her mouth calmly, but before she could speak, Sophie stood up. The chair scraped sharply against the marble floor. Everyone froze, even Vivian, because Sophie rarely interrupted adults. Especially not Vivian. The 12-year-old's hands trembled slightly beside her dress, but her voice came out clear. No. Silence. Complete silence. Vivian blinked. Excuse me. Sophie swallowed hard. You always say things like that about Mom. Easton stared at his daughter in shock. Vivian recovered quickly. Sweetheart adults sometimes discuss. No. Sophie interrupted again, louder this time. You say Mom makes Dad miserable. Ina stopped breathing. The room felt unreal suddenly, because this moment had lived inside her fears for months. The children finally speaking the truth aloud. Vivian's expression hardened instantly. You're misunderstanding conversations. Sophie shook her head. No, I'm not. Her voice cracked slightly now. She cries after you leave. The sentence shattered something invisible across the table. Easton looked physically uncomfortable. Good. Let him finally sit inside the consequences of his silence. Vivian laughed softly. Oh, honey, your mother is emotional about everything. And suddenly Eli stood too, small, terrified, brave anyway. No, she's not. The room went still again. Eli's little hands curled into fists beside his sides. You're mean to Mom all the time. Vivian's face changed completely now. Not grandmotherly, cold, controlled, dangerous. Eli, sit down. No. Even Easton looked stunned hearing his son say it. Children raised around controlling adults rarely disobey publicly, but emotional truth had finally become heavier than fear. Eli's eyes filled with tears. You make Sophie cry too. Ina felt her own tears burning instantly, not because the children were defending her, because they had been carrying this alone for so long. Vivian looked toward Easton sharply. Do something. And there it was. Not concern, control. Easton rubbed his forehead. Sophie, Eli, calm down. But Sophie looked directly at him now, and the disappointment in her eyes nearly destroyed the room. "You never protect Mom." Easton physically froze, because children speak with devastating simplicity. No corporate language, no manipulation, just truth. Vivian suddenly stood. This is exactly what happens when children are emotionally manipulated. Ina laughed softly before she could stop herself. The sound startled everyone, including her, because it wasn't sad. It was exhausted. "You really can't hear yourself anymore, can you?" Vivian turned sharply. "You've poisoned these children against this family." "No," Ina replied quietly. "You did." Easton stepped in immediately. "Enough." But nobody listened now. Not anymore. Years of silence were collapsing too fast. Vivian pointed toward Ina. "She turned them against me because she knows Easton deserves better." Sophie gasped softly. Eli looked horrified, and suddenly the entire illusion shattered, because Vivian had finally said it openly in front of the children. No more subtle manipulation, no more hidden poison, just cruelty, raw and visible. Easton looked furious now. "Mom!" But Vivian kept going. "She has spent years dragging this family down emotionally." "That's not true!" Sophie shouted. Her voice echoed across the dining room. Then Sophie looked at Ina. Actually looked at her. And Ina saw something devastating in her daughter's face. Guilt. "I thought maybe Grandma was right before," Sophie whispered shakily. "But Mom is the only one who always stays." Ina's heart physically cracked, because children blame themselves for emotional confusion they never created. Eli suddenly reached into his hoodie pocket with trembling hands. "I recorded it." Every adult at the table went still. Vivian frowned sharply, recorded what Eli looked terrified now, but determined. "The things you say about Mom." Easton's face drained of color instantly. Ina's pulse slowed. Not panic, recognition. This was the moment everything changed. Vivian stepped forward sharply. "Eli, give me that." He moved backward immediately. "No." Easton crouched carefully. "Buddy, no," Eli shouted suddenly. Tears spilled down his cheeks. "You always let her hurt Mom." The sentence exploded through the room. Easton looked like he'd been slapped. "Good. Finally." Eli pressed play, and suddenly Vivian's voice filled the elegant dining room through tiny phone speakers. Those children would be better off without Ina. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then another recording. "Easton deserves someone sophisticated. Someone like Celeste." Vivian's face went white. Sophie started crying quietly. Easton stared at his mother in horror. And Ina just sat there, still, watching years of manipulation collapse under the weight of truth. The recording continued. "She's emotionally weak. She ruined his ambition. She trapped him with children." Each sentence landed like shattered glass across the table. Vivian suddenly lunged forward. "Turn that off." But Sophie stepped between them. Actually stepped between them. "Stop hurting Mom." The room fell silent again. Heavy. Broken. And for the first time in years, Ina realized something profound. Her children no longer saw her through Vivian's lies. They saw her clearly now, and somewhere deep inside that realization, a wounded part of Ina finally began healing. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the recording ended. The silence inside the dining room felt alive, heavy, humiliating, final. Vivian stood frozen beside the table, her face drained of color beneath the chandelier light. For the first time since Ina met her, she looked old, not powerful, not polished, just exposed. Sophie was still crying quietly. Eli clung tightly to Ina's arm like he was afraid someone might pull him away. And Easton looked at his mother with something dangerously close to disbelief. You said that he asked quietly. Vivian recovered immediately. People like her always do. It was taken out of context. Ina almost laughed. Out of context. The favorite refuge of cruel people once consequences arrive. Sophie shook her head fiercely. No, it wasn't. Vivian's expression hardened. You shouldn't be recording adults. There shouldn't have been anything horrible to record, Ina replied softly. That landed harder than yelling ever could. Easton dragged a hand across his face. This has gone too far. Again. Not apology, not accountability. Just discomfort. Like emotional destruction only mattered now that it became impossible to hide. Vivian pointed sharply toward Ina. She manipulated those children against me. Sophie looked genuinely shocked. No, she didn't. Her voice cracked from crying. You always say Mom ruins everything. Vivian stepped closer immediately. Sophie, sweetheart, you're emotional right now. Stop calling me emotional. The sudden anger in Sophie's voice stunned the room. Because children raised around manipulation eventually recognized the language used to silence them. Easton stood abruptly. That's enough. But Sophie turned toward him now, and something in her expression broke Ina's heart completely. Disappointment. Deep, painful disappointment. You never say that to Grandma. The sentence sliced straight through him. Ina saw it happen. The realization, too late, but real. Sophie wiped tears from her cheeks angrily. You always let her hurt Mom. Easton opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was no defense left, not after the recordings, not after months of silence. Eli suddenly whispered, I thought Mom was bad for a while. The room shattered emotionally. Ina physically stopped breathing. Eli looked devastated immediately after admitting it. I'm sorry, he cried. Grandma kept saying Dad was happier before Mom changed. Vivian tried to interrupt instantly. That is not what I meant. Yes, it is, Sophie snapped. The entire dining room froze again, because Sophie never snapped at adults, especially not Vivian. But something fundamental had shifted tonight. Fear was losing its grip. Sophie looked directly at Easton. And you never stopped her. Easton looked pale now, actually pale, because children see betrayal differently than adults. Simpler, crueler, more honest. You let Grandma make us think Mom was the problem. Ina felt tears burning behind her eyes again, not from pain this time, from grief, because her children had been carrying emotional confusion they never deserved, and no adult protected them, not even her. That realization hurt worst of all. Then suddenly another voice entered the room, maybe because he agreed with her. Everyone turned sharply. Celeste Whitmore stood near the dining room entrance, elegant as always, but tense. No warmth in her face tonight, only exhaustion. Vivian looked horrified. What are you doing here? Easton's expression darkened instantly. Celeste. Interesting, not relieved, not affectionate, afraid. Celeste walked slowly into the room while removing leather gloves carefully. I came because I'm tired of lies. Nobody moved. Ina studied her quietly. This was not the polished, confident woman from the galas anymore. This looked like someone emotionally cornered. Celeste looked directly at Sophie and Eli first. And for the first time since meeting her, she looked ashamed. You kids shouldn't have had to hear any of this. Vivian scoffed immediately. Oh, please, spare us the performance. Celeste ignored her completely, then she turned toward Ina. I didn't know everything. The room went still. Easton's jaw tightened. Celeste. No, she interrupted sharply. I'm done covering for you. That shocked everyone, including Ina, because until now, Celeste had always moved carefully, strategically. never emotionally. But tonight something had changed. Maybe public collapse destroys illusions for everyone involved. "You told me your marriage was emotionally dead," Celeste said coldly to Easton. "You said Ina was unstable, manipulative." Ina felt physically numb listening, not because it surprised her, because hearing the lies spoken aloud made them grotesquely real. Celeste laughed bitterly. "And meanwhile, she's been the only adult protecting these children emotionally." Vivian stood instantly. "This is inappropriate." "No," Celeste replied sharply. "What's inappropriate is turning children against their mother because you couldn't tolerate another woman mattering more than you." The sentence hit Vivian like a slap, and suddenly everything cracked open completely. Years of emotional warfare finally spoken aloud. Vivian's face twisted. "You arrogant little no," Celeste interrupted. "You wanted Easton emotionally dependent forever." Ina threatened that because he actually loved her once. Once. The word landed painfully. Easton looked furious now. Enough. But nobody listened anymore. Not tonight. Not after years of silence. Celeste turned toward Ina slowly. "I'm sorry." Real remorse looked strange on her. Human. Tired. "I thought he was trapped in a miserable marriage," she admitted quietly. "I didn't realize he was helping create the misery." Easton stared at her in disbelief. "You're blaming me," Celeste laughed harshly. "You let your mother psychologically destroy your wife." The truth echoed brutally across the room. Sophie started crying harder. Eli buried his face against Ina's side. And suddenly, Ina realized something devastating. This dinner would live inside her children forever. The night truth exploded. The night the family finally stopped pretending. Vivian pointed toward Celeste furiously. "You seduced a married man." Celeste looked directly back at her. "And you encouraged it." Silence. Cold. Deadly. Because everyone knew she was right. Vivian had practically handed Easton to her. Easton finally slammed his hand against the table. "Stop talking like I had no responsibility here." "There it is," Celeste said quietly. "The first honest thing you've said all night." Easton looked exhausted suddenly. Not powerful, not controlled. Small. The illusion around him was collapsing too fast, and for the first time, his children were watching clearly. Sophie looked at him with tears running down her face. "Did you want Celeste to replace Mom?" The question destroyed the room. Easton looked completely unprepared for it, because children ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. "No," he said quickly, but even he sounded uncertain. Sophie shook her head slowly. "You acted like it." That sentence finished something. Ina felt it. The emotional balance inside the family shifting permanently, because the children no longer viewed her as the unstable center of the conflict. They finally saw the truth. And Easton saw it too. For the first time since this began, he looked afraid. Not of divorce, not of scandal, of losing the emotional trust of his children forever. And deep down, he knew he deserved to. The collapse began quietly. That was the terrifying part. Not dramatic explosions, not public screaming. Just doors slowly closing around Eastonbury one by one. 3 days after the dinner, Hale Capital Partners withdrew from one of Easton's largest pending deals. 2 senior executives resigned from his division by Friday. By Monday morning, rumors about financial misconduct were circulating through every major corporate circle in Connecticut and Manhattan. And for the first time in years, Easton looked tired. Actually tired. Not polished exhaustion. Not executive stress carefully hidden behind tailored suits and expensive watches. This looked heavier. Human. Ina noticed it when he walked into the kitchen one morning while Sophie packed her school bag beside her. He looked older somehow, like consequences had weight. "Morning," Ina said calmly. Easton looked surprised she spoke at all. "Morning." Sophie barely glanced at him. That hurt him more than he expected. Ina saw it instantly. Children withdrawing affection creates a different kind of punishment. Eli entered moments later and immediately hugged Ina around the waist. "Can you sign my permission slip?" "Of course." Easton stood there watching quietly while the children naturally gravitated toward her. Not because Ina manipulated them, because emotional safety always reveals itself over time. Easton cleared his throat. "I can drive you guys to school." Sophie hesitated. Tiny pause, but devastating. Mom already said she would. The disappointment that crossed Easton's face lasted less than a second. Still long enough for Ina to notice. Good. Let him finally understand what emotional neglect costs. After the children left, silence filled the kitchen. Easton stared down at untouched coffee, then quietly asked, "Are you happy now?" Ina almost laughed, not because it was funny, because even now he still believed her pain existed to punish him. "You think this is revenge? I think you wanted me destroyed." Ina looked at him carefully. "No, I wanted you honest." The simplicity of the answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Easton rubbed his face slowly. Everything is falling apart. There it was, finally. Not denial, not arrogance, reality. Ina leaned against the counter. "You let it." Easton looked up sharply. "You think I'm the only person responsible? Interesting." Even now he searched desperately for shared blame. "You had an affair. You emotionally checked out years before that." Ina inhaled slowly. "We could have fixed distance. We could have fixed exhaustion. We could have fixed resentment." Then she looked directly at him. "But you chose humiliation instead." That one landed deeply, because he knew it was true. The affair hurt, but the emotional cruelty destroyed the marriage. Vivian still refused accountability completely, which made her increasingly frantic now that Easton's social image was collapsing publicly. Ina walked into the living room that afternoon and found Vivian pacing furiously while talking on the phone. "No, this is temporary," Vivian snapped. "Easton will recover." Then she noticed Ina and immediately lowered her voice. Interesting. Fear. Finally. Vivian hung up sharply. "You seem very calm for someone destroying her own family." Ina folded laundry quietly. "You destroyed this family when you taught my children I was disposable." Vivian scoffed. "Oh, please. Easton was unhappy long before Celeste. Then he should have divorced me honestly." That silenced her briefly, because honesty had never been part of their strategy. Control had. Vivian stepped closer. "You think those children won't resent you for this?" Eventually, Ina looked directly at her. "They already resent what you did." Vivian's face hardened. "No, they're confused because you've poisoned them emotionally." Ina almost admired the commitment. Even now, Vivian genuinely believed herself innocent. That level of delusion required years of practice. Then suddenly, Vivian's voice cracked slightly. "You have no idea what Easton sacrificed to build this life." There it was. The truth hidden underneath everything. Not love, image, status, success. Ina set the folded towel down slowly. "And what exactly did I sacrifice?" Vivian didn't answer, because acknowledging Ina's sacrifices would force her to acknowledge Ina's value. And Vivian had spent years refusing to do that. That evening, Claire Monroe arrived unexpectedly with takeout and legal updates. The children adored her immediately. probably because Claire spoke to them like intelligent human beings instead of emotional obstacles. Sophie laughed for the first time in weeks, while Claire helped Eli build a ridiculous gingerbread spaceship at the kitchen table. Ina watched quietly from across the room. Healing looked so small sometimes. Tiny moments, safe laughter, children relaxing again. Claire approached her later while the kids watched television upstairs. "You okay?" Ina exhaled slowly. "I don't know." Claire studied her carefully. "You still love him." Ina closed her eyes briefly. "I miss who I thought he was." That felt more honest. Claire nodded gently. "Those are different things." A heavy silence followed, then Claire spoke quietly. "Easton tried contacting me." Ina looked up instantly. What he wanted to know if I was encouraging instability. Ina almost smiled bitterly, still blaming outside influence instead of his own actions. "What did you say?" Claire's expression sharpened. "I told him powerful women don't create instability. They expose it." The words stayed with Ina long after Claire left. 2 days later, Easton came home early unexpectedly. No assistant calls, no late meetings, no polished mask, just exhaustion. Ina found him sitting alone in the dark living room, staring at old family photos on the fireplace shelves. Sophie's first birthday, beach vacations, Christmas mornings, back when everyone still looked genuinely happy. Easton spoke without turning around. "I used to think success would fix everything." Ina stayed standing near the doorway. "And did it?" He laughed softly. "Broken. No." Silence stretched between them. Then Easton whispered, "I don't even know when I became this person." The honesty startled her, because real self-awareness had been absent for so long. Ina walked closer slowly. "You stopped seeing people emotionally," she said quietly. "You started seeing them based on usefulness." The sentence visibly hit him, because deep down, he knew. Vivian had trained him to value admiration over intimacy, control over vulnerability, image over honesty. Easton looked up at her finally, and for the first time in months, there was no arrogance left, only regret. Real regret. "I never wanted the kids hurt." Ina felt tears sting instantly, but they were. Easton nodded slowly, like accepting a sentence. Then he whispered something that nearly shattered her. "I think I became my mother." The room fell silent, because that was the tragedy underneath everything. Easton spent years believing he was protecting family legacy, strength, and success, while slowly becoming emotionally incapable of protecting the people who loved him most. Then he looked at Ina with hollow eyes. "Please tell me we can still fix this." The question lingered painfully between them, because once trust dies slowly over years, love alone cannot resurrect it. Ina looked at the man she once would have destroyed herself to keep, and realized something heartbreaking. She no longer wanted to save him badly enough to lose herself again. Ina signed the divorce papers on a quiet Tuesday morning while sunlight spilled across Danielle Mercer's office windows. No dramatic music, no screaming, no cinematic breakdown. Just a pen trembling slightly between her fingers and 10 years of emotional survival ending with ink. Danielle reviewed the final page carefully. "You're sure?" Ina looked down at the signature for a long moment. Strangely, she didn't feel devastation. She felt grief, but grief and regret were different things. "Yes," she said softly, "I'm sure." Outside the law office, Manhattan moved around her in sharp winter light. Taxis, coffee carts, executives rushing across sidewalks, women in heels balancing ambition and exhaustion. Life continuing. Ina stood there for several seconds, breathing cold air into lungs that finally felt less trapped. Then her phone buzzed. Sophie. Mom, can we get sushi tonight? Ina smiled before answering. Absolutely. That was the moment she realized something important. For the first time in years, her children sounded emotionally relaxed around her again. No tension, no careful emotional monitoring, no fear of upsetting adults, just children. Healing had started quietly. The move out of the mansion happened 2 weeks later. Vivian called it humiliating. Easton called it temporary. Ina called it necessary. The new apartment overlooked the Long Island Sound from the top floor of a luxury building in Stamford. Smaller than the mansion, but warmer somehow. Alive. No marble emptiness, no emotionally suffocating silence, no constant criticism lingering in the walls. The first night there, Sophie walked barefoot through the living room, staring at the city lights. It feels peaceful here. Ina nearly cried instantly, because children always know the emotional truth of a home. Eli claimed the corner bedroom immediately because it had space for his books and Lego sets. This place feels safe, he whispered later while helping unpack kitchen boxes. Safe. The word shattered Ina softly from the inside, because no child should describe their own home like a relief. Meanwhile, Easton unraveled quietly. The divorce filing became public inside their social circles within days. His company's audit intensified. Celeste officially separated herself from all business structures connected to him. And Vivian became vicious. She called constantly at first, demanding, blaming, accusing Ina of manipulating the children. But something had changed fundamentally now. Ina no longer absorbed guilt automatically. One evening, Vivian appeared unannounced outside the apartment building wearing camel cashmere and fury. You cannot keep my grandchildren from me. Ina stood calmly in the lobby. I'm not keeping them from you. You poisoned them against this family. No, Ina replied softly. Truth finally reached them. Vivian's expression twisted. You destroyed Easton. Ina looked at her carefully. No. Easton destroyed himself when he confused silence with strength. Vivian scoffed. You think you've won? The question lingered strangely. Won. As if relationships were wars instead of responsibilities. Ina shook her head slowly. There was never a winner here. For the first time, Vivian looked genuinely lost, because women like her understood power, not emotional accountability. Then she whispered bitterly, You took everything from him. Ina almost laughed, because the irony was unbearable. No, she said quietly. I stopped giving him everything from me. Vivian had no response to that. Weeks passed, and slowly, painfully, Ina rebuilt herself. Claire Monroe brought her back into consulting gradually through remote strategy work first. The first presentation meeting terrified Ina so badly she nearly canceled. She stood outside the boardroom gripping coffee with shaking hands while old insecurities screamed through her mind. You disappeared. You're outdated. You're weak now. Then Claire leaned close and whispered, They should be nervous you came back. Something inside Ina steadied instantly. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. And by the end of it, 3 executives were rewriting entire projections based on her recommendations. Driving home afterward, Ina cried so hard she had to pull over near the water. Not because she failed, because she remembered herself. Meanwhile, Sophie changed in subtle ways. She laughed louder now, started inviting friends over again, stopped apologizing constantly. One evening, while they cooked pasta together, Sophie suddenly asked quietly, Mom, why did you stay with Dad so long? The question hurt because it deserved honesty. Ina stirred the sauce slowly. because I thought loving people meant enduring pain quietly." Sophie frowned. "But that's sad." Ina smiled sadly. "Yes, it is." Silence settled softly between them. Then Sophie whispered, "I don't ever want someone to make me feel small." Ina looked at her daughter carefully and realized this was the real victory. Not revenge, not divorce. "Breaking the cycle. You shouldn't," Ina said gently. "The right people won't need you smaller to feel bigger." Sophie hugged her tightly after that, longer than usual, like she finally understood something about womanhood and survival all at once. Easton kept trying to reconnect, at first through practical excuses, school schedules, financial paperwork, forgotten items, then emotionally. One rainy afternoon, he appeared outside the apartment holding Eli's science project with exhausted eyes and soaked hair. Ina almost didn't recognize him anymore. Without the polished image and corporate confidence, he looked painfully human. "I didn't know he left this in my car," Easton said quietly. Ina took the project carefully. "Thanks." An awkward silence followed. Then Easton looked around the apartment slowly. Family photos, warm lighting, children's shoes by the door, laughter from inside. Life, real life, not performance. "You seem happier here," he admitted. Ina answered honestly, "I feel calmer." That visibly hurt him. Good. Not because she wanted him suffering, because he needed to understand what emotional peace looked like. Easton shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I miss us." Ina felt grief rise again. Not temptation, grief, because once upon a time she would have done anything to hear those words. But timing changes meaning. "You miss being loved unconditionally?" she said softly. Easton looked stunned, then slowly, ashamed, because deep down he knew she was right. He stepped closer carefully. "I know I failed you." Ina nodded slightly. Yes, no dramatic denial, no comforting him emotionally anymore, just truth. And somehow that honesty affected him more deeply than rage ever could. Before leaving, Easton hesitated near the doorway, then quietly asked, "Do you hate me?" Ina looked at the man who once held her entire heart in his hands and realized something surprising. "No," she said softly, "but I finally love myself enough to stop choosing people who hurt me." The sentence stayed with Easton long after he walked away. And later that night, while helping Eli finish homework at the kitchen table, Sophie looked up suddenly and smiled at Ina. "You know what? What I think you're brave." Ina felt tears sting instantly, because for years she feared her children would remember her as weak. Instead, they were finally seeing her clearly. Spring arrived quietly, not dramatically, not like the movies where healing appears overnight beneath sunlight and music. Real healing was slower than that. It looked like Sophie laughing with her mouth fully open again after months of emotional caution. It looked like Eli sleeping through the night without wandering anxiously into Ina's room. It looked like peace becoming normal instead of suspicious. 6 months after leaving the mansion, Ina stood barefoot in the kitchen of the apartment flipping pancakes while morning light poured through wide glass windows overlooking the water. Mom Eli called from the couch. Sophie stole the good strawberries again. "I did not." Sophie shouted back immediately. "You absolutely did. I'm growing. You're 12. I'm emotionally growing." Ina laughed so suddenly she nearly dropped the spatula. That sound still surprised her sometimes. Real laughter. Not the careful, exhausted version she used to force through charity dinners and emotional humiliation. The apartment smelled like coffee and maple syrup. Music played softly from Sophie's phone. Backpacks sat near the front door. Normal life. Small life. Beautiful life. And the strangest part, Ina no longer missed the mansion at all. Not the marble floors, not the status, not the image, because peace felt more luxurious than appearances ever had. Later that afternoon, Ina walked into Monroe and Pierce Consulting wearing a fitted cream blazer and confidence she rebuilt herself. The entire energy of the office shifted around her now. Not because she demanded attention, because she no longer apologized for existing. Claire met her near the boardroom carrying coffee. "You ready?" Ina smiled, terrified. Good. Smart people stay a little terrified. The presentation lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, the client approved Ina's restructuring proposal almost immediately. As executives shook her hand afterward, Ina experienced something strange. Not triumph, recognition, like reconnecting with a version of herself she thought had died. Claire squeezed her shoulder once everyone left. "Told you they should fear your comeback." Ina laughed softly. "I forgot what it felt like to be respected." Claire's expression softened instantly. That should never depend on a man. The sentence stayed with Ina the entire drive home. That evening, Easton picked up the children for dinner. Co-parenting remained awkward, but calmer now. Easton had changed in subtle ways over the past months. Quieter, more present with the children, less defensive. Therapy helped, according to Sophie. Apparently, he cried during one session. That information complicated Ina emotionally more than she expected, because part of healing meant accepting something painful. People can genuinely regret hurting you and still not deserve access to you anymore. When Easton arrived at the apartment, Eli launched himself into his arms, excitedly holding a school certificate. "Dad, I got first place in science." Easton's entire face softened. "That's amazing, buddy." Sophie smiled carefully beside them, still guarded sometimes, but trying. Everyone was trying now, even Easton. He looked toward Ina while the children grabbed jackets. "You look happy." The observation sounded almost disbelieving. Ina answered honestly, "I am. Not because life became perfect, because emotional survival no longer consumed all her energy." Easton nodded slowly, then quietly said, "I'm glad." And surprisingly, he meant it. That was the tragedy of growth sometimes. People become better only after destroying what mattered most. The children ran ahead toward the elevator while Easton lingered near the doorway. "I saw my mother yesterday." Ina leaned lightly against the counter. "How did that go?" A humorless laugh escaped him. "She blames you for everything still." Ina wasn't surprised. Vivian would rather lose relationships than surrender control. Easton looked exhausted suddenly. "She barely leaves the house anymore." There was no satisfaction inside Ina hearing that. Only sadness. Because bitterness isolates people eventually, and Vivian spent years building emotional prisons for others until she trapped herself inside one too. Easton shoved his hands into his pockets awkwardly. "She asked why the kids don't call much anymore." Ina looked toward the hallway where Sophie and Eli were laughing together. Children remember who made them feel emotionally safe. Easton nodded like the sentence physically hurt. Good. Some truth should hurt. Before leaving, he hesitated, then asked quietly, "Do you think they'll forgive me completely one day?" Ina thought carefully before answering. "Yes." Hope flickered briefly across his face. Then she continued softly, "But they'll never forget who protected them either." The hope faded into understanding, because forgiveness and trust were different things. Easton nodded once, then left quietly. That night, after the children returned home exhausted and happy from dinner, the three of them curled together on the couch, watching movies while rain tapped gently against the windows. Halfway through the second movie, Sophie rested her head against Ina's shoulder. Mom, yeah, I'm really sorry I believed Grandma sometimes. Ina immediately pulled her closer. You were a child, but I should have known.
No.
Ina kissed her forehead softly. Children are supposed to trust adults. That wasn't your fault, Sophie cried silently for a few seconds. Then whispered, You stayed kind even when people hurt you? Ina felt tears sting instantly, because kindness used to feel like weakness after everything she survived. Now she understood differently. Kindness wasn't weakness. Remaining kind without abandoning yourself was strength. Eli suddenly looked up from beneath his blanket cocoon. Are we okay now? The innocence of the question nearly shattered her. Ina looked around the apartment. At the soft lights, the messy blankets, the children pressed safely against her. At peace. Yes, she whispered, we're okay now. And for the first time in years, she truly meant it. Much later, after the children fell asleep, Ina stood alone by the apartment windows overlooking the dark water. Her reflection stared back at her softly, older, stronger, whole in ways she never expected. She thought about the woman she used to be, the exhausted wife begging to be loved correctly, the mother shrinking herself to keep peace, the woman who confused endurance with worth. And suddenly Ina realized something profound. Losing Easton hadn't destroyed her life. Losing herself almost had. Behind her, Sophie stirred sleepily from the couch. Mom Ina turned. You coming to bed? Ina smiled softly. Yeah, baby, I'm coming. She walked toward her children, slowly leaving the city lights glowing behind her. And before turning off the living room lamp, Ina glanced once toward the closed apartment door. Not with anger, not with heartbreak, but with peace. Because sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop reopening doors that nearly destroyed her. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak in life doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people we loved enough to sacrifice ourselves for. Ina's story reminds us how easy it is to slowly disappear inside relationships where love becomes conditional, where silence replaces protection, and where kindness is mistaken for weakness. But this story is not really about revenge. It's about awakening. Because there comes a moment in many people's lives when they realize surviving emotional pain is not the same as living. Ina spent years trying to keep peace by shrinking herself, apologizing for her feelings, and carrying the emotional weight of everyone around her. Like so many women, she believed endurance made her strong. But true strength was never about suffering quietly. True strength was learning when to stop abandoning yourself for people who would never do the same for you. One of the most powerful lessons in this story is that children see more than adults think they do. They may not understand every detail, but they always feel emotional truth. Sophie and Eli didn't need perfection from their mother. They needed honesty, warmth, safety, and love. And in the end, that mattered more than wealth appearances or social status. Easton lost his family long before the divorce papers were signed. He lost them the moment he stopped protecting the people who loved him most. Because love without respect eventually becomes emotional loneliness. And maybe that's the real message here. Never let anyone convince you that your softness makes you weak. The world can be cruel, but staying kind while protecting your self-worth is one of the bravest things a person can do. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what moment hurt you the most and what moment healed you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories about healing, self-worth, betrayal, and emotional strength, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next journey.